I'm really thrilled this morning to introduce our keynote speaker. Tim Dee is a BBC radio producer, broadcaster, and acclaimed writer of many nature-based books, including The Running Sky, Four Fields, Landfill, and my favorite, Greenery, Journeys in Springtime. In 2018, Tim was elected as a fellow at the Royal Society of Literature. Tim has lived and worked in Bristol and Cambridge over many years. He has family links with Minehead, and I'm pleased to say that Horner Wood is one of his favourite birding spots. Tim is joining us this morning, not from Exmoor, but from right down at the southern tip of South Africa. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you to the Society for inviting me to talk. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a lovely autumn day where I am, just a couple of houses short of the Cape of Good Hope. And I've said goodbye earlier this month to the last barn swallows that have been wintering amongst me. They've all gone on north now, and what I'm going to talk today about is some of those birds that have come to Exmoor in the last few weeks, including barn swallows, our familiar swallows in Britain, and particularly some of their journeys and how they've got to Exmoor. I'd like you to imagine a crucial trinity, a holy trinity for me of the best species of birds in the world, which Exmoor is famous for, has some of the best resources and reserves for. Three species, all of which are migrants, all of which have spent their winters in Africa, who've arrived into the oak woods, particularly of the Exmoor fringes, the Coombs, Horner Water, Eastwater, those woods around inland from Porlock and Minehead. Also into the Quantocks, it has to be said. Exmoor's not got sole rights to these birds, but three species of bird, magical birds: the wood warbler, the pied flycatcher, and the redstart. Now, please think, if you can, of about 3 or 4 weeks ago, mid-April, something like that, a dark night in Exmoor. There's probably been many dark nights in Exmoor in mid-April. Imagine, as I've done before, a walk around the woods at Horner Water on a mid-April day. The oak trees, some years already fleecing up in their lovely lamb's tails of catkins coming into leaf, but mostly still bare. And in that wood on that day, that mid-April day, just the first of my three birds has arrived. It's a redstart, a male redstart. Immaculate bird. I could spend the rest of this 20 minutes describing what it looks like. I trust you know them, and maybe I hope many of you will have seen them. And it's singing from the top of an oak tree. It wasn't there the day before, and it's arrived overnight. It's a night migrant, and it's arrived into where it's going to breed in the night, and it sings from the very first morning that it arrives. The other two species coming slightly later in the month, pied flycatchers. Again, the male will arrive before the females, and they'll immediately adopt either the territory it had last year, which is an extraordinary thing to think about, which I'll come back to, or a new space that it's found because it's never been in the wood before, although most likely it will have been in the wood before, most likely it will have been hatched in the wood before. And the third species, a couple of weeks later, in the beginning of May, I hope they're there by now. I know they've been seen on the coast around southwest England, wood warblers, an exquisite bird, the pied flycatcher, the black and white bird. The redstart is a multicolored, almost tropical colored bird. The wood warbler is a beautiful northern green, a kind of cool green above, and a silvery white underside, and it has a fabulously metallic silvery song that it sings from those oak trees. All three species can be seen in the same tree. All three species have arrived in Exmoor, in Horner Woods, overnight, one night, say in early May, and they're there then for the rest of the breeding season. So let's think a little bit about how those birds got there and how they traveled. I mean, remember, these are tiny little things. They weigh no more than 10 grams. They've got a brain the size of a pea. And yet within that brain, they have to have a function that's allowed them to both get to Africa, south of the Sahara, and turn around at a certain point and return north to Exmoor or wherever else they're breeding across Western Europe. All three species are quite widespread. In Britain, we're at the western limits of their range. Elsewhere into Eastern Europe and Russia, those birds are much more abundant than they are in Britain. Anyway, they've all been in, let's stick with our birds in Horner Wood. They were there, they hatched the year before. The adult birds of all those three species will have left their young behind in those woods and will have headed south. The young, amazingly, know already to head south themselves. They first of all leave in a roughly southerly direction, southeasterly or southwesterly direction, and they leave Europe. They know they've got to get out of Europe in one of those 2 points of the compass. But no one really knows how they do it or how they know that. What they don't know, though, is where the hell they're going. So they have an incredible drive to leave. These first birds that have never seen the night sky before they're hatched, never seen a horn of woods before they've hatched, and yet they know to leave. And they head south in a semi-random way. They find a place, and if they survive, they flourish in the winter time. All of them, all those 3 species, again, as I said, heading south over the Sahara. The Sahara itself is an extraordinary thing to contemplate, crossing 12 million square kilometers, the size of the USA, 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers in width, north to south. An extraordinary inhospitable terrain. I've been to the desert, in fact, explicitly looking for redstarts. My redstarts, as I like to think of them, that I'd seen at Horner Woods the year before, and saw redstarts in the southern side of the desert in Chad, waiting to commit themselves to their onward migration. Amazingly, a lot of those birds fly across the desert in a single journey. They weigh about 10 grams, as I say. They've got a brain the size of a pea. They know it's better to fly by night, so they fly because it's cooler. There's fewer predators around. The wind turbulence is reduced at night. The high dehydration and fat loss is much reduced. So it's worth their while, although they can't therefore sleep. But amazingly, they're also adapted not to sleep at night in their migration times. The fat they put on in their staging places before they commit themselves to their northward journeys alters their sleep patterns, as well as building up their body reserves. They fly north and they cross the desert. It probably takes them about 72 hours of night flying. Some of them fly through the day as well. Often in the day they drop down and might crouch motionless underneath the rock in order to keep out of the sun. They don't actually lose too much water apparently in that condition. Then as soon as sunset goes and color vision fades, they're up into the sky. They can't see any better than us at night. The human's vision and those small migrant bird vision is about the same. What they can do though is read the star maps, and quite possibly also, no one knows for sure about all these species, detect or taste, as it were, the magnetism of the Earth's field. So they have a number of tools that a night traveler like me or you wouldn't have when crossing the desert. And amazing to think these tiny birds have got what is effectively a map, a compass, a clock, and a calendar within them that guides them over the sand, and then of course over the Mediterranean, which is no mean feat for a small bird to cross as well. Some birds indeed cross the Sahara and the Mediterranean without stopping. Pied flycatchers in the autumn flying south from Horner Wood stage almost entirely. They fly from Somerset, Devon to western Iberia, and they fatten up in northern Spain, western Portugal, and then fly in a single journey from there south across the rest of Spain and Portugal, across the Mediterranean, and all the way across the Sahara. So winter then in the Sahel regions and slightly further north in West Africa, in wet forest. Redstarts, my favourite birds of all those three, go slightly further east, right down the middle of the Sahara, and they go slightly further into the Sahel, this sort of semi-arid, semi-desert area that runs as a broad band across south of the Sahara. There they spend their winters. And amazingly, again, just as I said, those birds coming to Horner Woods are loyal to the tree that they might have hatched in as their tree for breeding in the following year. In the wintertime as well, having established a wintering place, the birds will come back, if they survive it, to the very same wintering place the next year. So once they've made the journey once, they know where to go. So that's my story, really. They fly across the desert alone. Night migrants normally fly at about 2,500 to 3,000 feet, where headwinds and tailwinds are more in their favor. Some birds have recently been recorded flying much higher than that. It's amazing how little we've known and still know about how they managed to do it. Amazing to think for a moment also about how theories. I thought I might read a list of conflicting theories, which will just give us an idea of how scientists have struggled. This was made nearly 100 years ago, but in many ways there's been not many substantial advances. This is a little quotation then from my book, Greenery, which loves those three birds and loves all the woods especially. But this is just to give you some inkling of the kind of our human bafflement, the extraordinary amazement that we felt in the contemplation of migration. So someone said there are definite routes of migration. Somebody else, there are no definite routes of migration. Someone else, birds learn how to migrate. Someone else, birds migrate by instinct. Orientation is traditional. Orientation is congenital. There is no leadership. There is leadership. The weather has no essential influence. The weather has an essential influence. Temperature plays an important part. Temperature is not an incentive. Flight occurs at 3,000 feet. Flight occurs at 35,000 feet. The original home of birds is the tropics. The original home is not the tropics. We still don't know the answer to the last question. What's a very fascinating instance is that there is a single population of barn swallows, which is a worldwide species. There are North American barn swallows that winter in South America. There are East Asian barn swallows that winter in Southeast Asia and Australasia. Barn swallow is a global species and it's migratory in all of its range except for one little population in the Nile Valley. And there's some speculation that this bird that doesn't migrate there, doesn't need to migrate, might be the origin of all the barn swallows in the world. Migration is an adaptive, evolutionarily adaptive behavior. Birds do it in order to exploit the situation that they find in front of them. And we have to think also that Exmoor and the migrants to Exmoor are relatively new on the scene for them. Of course, the last glaciation in Britain that finished about 10,000 years ago, at that point, there was no summer migrants came to Britain. It was positively too cold for them. They were hiding out in refugia in Southeast Europe and in Iberia. So in that last relatively short time, in biological terms, in the last 10,000 years, all these birds have learned to move north gradually and then to return south. Extraordinary to contemplate that, this learning, this discovering that there were places to go, such as this beautiful temperate rainforests of the western combes of England and Wales and up the west coast of Scotland too, that could give them a better living than they would have had had they stayed in where they were. Those barn swallows in the Nile never needed to leave the Nile because it remained green and fly rich throughout the year for them. So that's probably about as much from me as you need. I mean, I love also the thought of other bird watchers looking at these birds and figuring out how they go. Interesting that itself, not all birds fly at night, not all birds are night migrants. And there's some curiosities here. No one really knows why some birds should be night migrants and arrive in Exmoor in the night or in the following morning. And other birds might be day migrants. You might have seen pipits and wagtails flying around in the daytime. I've seen them many times, meadow pipits bravely leaving Minehead. I mean, I know a lot of people feel the need to bravely leave Minehead and heading north across the Severn towards equally uninviting to my mind, hills of South Wales. Meadow pipits, wagtails do that. Other birds are night migrants. All of the warblers, thrushes, you might have heard on an Exmoor night, a beautiful wintry or autumn night, that seep of redwings flying overhead, the sense of a net of birds quietly communicating with one another, seeping as they fly over the sky over your head. They're thrushes and redwings, night migrants. They're birds that actually come into Britain from further north, from Scandinavia, to spend their winters with us. So yes, flycatchers, chats, thrushes and warblers fly by night. Tits, finches, larks, wagtails, pipits and crows fly by day. Big birds often fly by day because they need, like storks, cranes, birds that Homer was familiar with and the writers of the Bible were familiar with as indicators of seasonal change and so on. They fly by day, but that's because they mostly need warm air, daytime air, thermals in order to get height and then to keep themselves going. Swallows, our lovely barn swallows, to come back to finish with the place I started with. are day flyers. They fly up to 200 kilometers a day on migration. They fly just about 5 or 6 feet above the ground. They catch flies as they go. They roost in big agglomerations overnight, and then they head up again in the daytime. So you get that wonderful sense of the sociable bird on the move when you see a flock of swallows arriving. They're almost always travel with others of their kind. Pity my poor little wood warbler or redstart or pipe flycatcher. They've done it all by themselves, and amazingly they make it. Though most of them make it, although times are not so easy. The desert is generally a bastard to get across. The Mediterranean is not so easier either. It makes me often think also of the plight of human refugees. When I was watching Redstarts in Chad, I was also in the company, and not that I ever saw them, but I was told that they were there, of human refugees, human migrants desperately seeking to leave Eritrea and Ethiopia and South Sudan and move north across the desert and then across the Mediterranean, an equally perilous journey for those human migrants as it is for the birds. I think looking at migration can often make you feel that. It also makes you feel how home for birds is so different from our own feelings of home. I mean, we love to travel and journey, but we have a strong sense of our own home. And when I first saw barn swallows here in South Africa, although I knew intellectually that they came here for their winters, I looked at them and thought they were away from home, because my home is Bristol, the West Country, and I knew them as my swallows, and I wanted them to be in my home. Although, of course, in December they're much better off in Cape Town, where I'm the ones watching them. So that's the sort of baggage we carry with us. Gilbert White, who loved swallows above all birds, and was a very acute and extraordinary observer in 1700 Hampshire, couldn't quite bear to think that his swallows went south. He had a brother who lived in Gibraltar who saw swallows moving south across the Straits of Gibraltar into North Africa, but he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that his darling swallows actually went all that way. He clung to this belief, which was widely held at the time, that they might have hibernated, because he'd seen swallows flying low over the water in the dusk time, and assumed just as night turned, they actually dipped under the water. He had ponds drained and thatched roofs cut open, hoping to find sleeping, hibernating swallows. He didn't do that, but and in fact, had he gone to Horner Woods or even onto Dunkery on an April morning, you might have seen swallows dipping in, coming down, touching down, descending towards Exmoor, just as the redstarts and pipe flycatchers and wood warblers had, having crossed in the night, the swallows coming in the day. So hold on to that. Go to Horner Woods now. Those birds, those amazing survivors. Not one of those birds you might see today hasn't crossed the Sahara twice. Astounding to think of that. And when they first did it, they were only about 6 weeks or so out of the nest. Equally astounding. Night migration is one of the wonders of the world, but seeing the birds in the daytime, as you can at Horner, is equally as good. Thanks very much.